I'm Henry Daniels, Jr. My dad moved here in 1943 in the Air Force, and he met my mom. She was a senior at AV High, and they got married right after that and moved into Little Rock. My grandparents owned a little orchard there in town and a few lots right next to it. My cousins and my folks bought next to the grandparents, and that's where I grew up, right from the on 82nd there above the little school at Alpine there. I'm Danny because that's what they nicknamed Dad in the Air Force, so hardly anybody knows the Henry. They look around, go, who are they talking to? And I'll start talking, and they're looking at me funny. But anyhow, I grew up as Danny, and most everybody that grew up with me wouldn't know who Henry was. So anyhow, moving on, my grandmother was the postmaster in Little Rock when she retired in 1971 or 2, somewhere right around in there. She had worked out at NASA with my granddad, and my dad ended up being at NASA machinist, working on the X-15 and X-1 and all them, the lunar module and you name it. He retired in what would that have been, 78, I think, and bought the Orbit in 76 so that he'd have it for retirement and whatever. And back then I ran the Orbit for Mom and Dad for the first year or two while they were working, and that way Dad would work it on the weekend and I could work it during the week, and we kept it open 7 days a week like Dad wanted for 20 odd years, and seems like just the other day, haha. It was originally a garage there in Little Rock. George Langer, he started Orbit when I was real little, probably, what would that have been? Somewhere around 1960, give or take. I know I went in Orbit when I was probably about that age. I was more like 10, 12. Went in there with a friend of mine. His dad took us in Orbit, and it was like, oh wow. At the time he had a place stacked high with, you name it, all kind of neat antiques, cast iron and old stoves and you name it, and purple glass everywhere. And I loved old purple glass, so I was just hooked from then on. And after a while, my mom and dad wanted to know what that Orbit place was about, because me and my buddies are always talking about it. We'd go in there after school on the way home from Almondale, and nowadays Almondale would be called Keppel Academy, I think. But anyhow, back then it was Almondale, and we didn't like riding a bus, so we just walked back and forth. And after school, George didn't care if we went out and back, and he had old antique Outdoor Life and Field and Stream magazines from the 20s and 30s, 40s, and we thought how cool, we could sit back there and read them old magazines for hours. And anyhow, in 1976, early in the bicentennial, George got killed in a accident back in Nebraska. They owned a home back there. He'd go back a few times a year and collect antiques up. His sister and her family lived there, and so they'd always pick up things for him. And whenever he'd go back, he'd buy things, and then he'd bring a truckload back to Little Rock. And when he'd show up, it'd be fun for a few weeks because there'd be lots and lots of neat new things. But he was back there, and they didn't realize they had a trouble with a water heater, and he didn't know that the basement had filled up with gas, and it blew him right out the wall. And his wife was in an old-fashioned bathtub, and so the explosion went over her, and she survived without any real, I don't remember her having any damage or whatever. But George, he might have made it in a real state-of-the-art burn center, but I think he lasted about a week. And he had such bad burns all over his body that it took him out. And so anyhow, my dad had heard that a friend of ours got to orbit, and when Otto came by to one night wanting to sell Dad something or another, Dad's telling him how neat the orbit, how lucky he was to have that orbit, and within a week we were the lucky owners of the orbit. And Otto would rather go gambling and having fun than working at being a businessman at the time, I think. But that's sort of off the subject. But anyhow, yeah, we moved in the last week of 1976, and we got about 10 minutes worth of instructions on how to be antique dealers. And Margie had sheds at home that were full of antiques, so for a long time Dad was buying all of them, and that helped keep it stocked. But him and Mom loved going out and buying all the time, everywhere they could. And so yeah, that should do 1976 then. Well, I was just kind of barely an adult when Mom and Dad bought it. In 76, I would have been 23 or 4, something like that. I ran it for a couple of years for them, and then I had a backhoe for a long time and ran it around the valley here. And Mom and Dad had retired by then, and they took it over, and then they wanted to enjoy their retirement after a while. So my brother-in-law and me, we started buying it for Mom and Dad. And after, I don't know, a few months, we realized that the economy wasn't going to keep both of us in there, so we flipped a coin, and I lost. I ended up with Orbit. And he ended up going to aircraft and doing a lot better than I did in orbit. But anyway, that's here and there. But for a long old time, I still like to see that coin we used. He was the one pulled it out of his pocket. So. But anyhow, I know he had more than one two-headed coin. One buddy that lived across the field from me, his dad was one of the old farmers in town, and so we grew up, running around all the orchards and up at the Little Rock Dam all the time whenever we could. And so Little Rock Dam was one of the fun places that were real neat to go. And the creek, when it did run water, that was always fun. Throwing peaches and pears and whatever. Working in the fruit in the summers every year was kind of a highlight for us. Little Rock has changed so much without all the orchards now, and it's just hard to see it as the same town. But when we were little, that one buddy, his grandmother, she had been there forever, and she could tell you how many cars went north or east and how many cars went west every day of the week. She lived right there on the highway, and I can remember walking down the highway at night where we could be in the middle of the road for minutes at a time without a car coming in either direction. And nowadays, 138, you don't get on it, but what is scary, you can't hardly cross it on foot without it. But it was just like a Mayberry kind of town back then. It's when you know most everybody, whether you know them real close or not, you know who they are kind of thing. And it's just a whole different world from now where hardly know anybody out there. Most of the old timers are gone, but just my favorite memories are growing up in a town where we didn't know where the key to the house was when I grew up. We might find it once a year and then lose it immediately, and nobody locked the doors. When Dad built his home down there, we didn't have windows. We did for a long old time. The telephone was right there at the front window where you could reach through, and yeah, it was just a whole different kind of world. Well, my granddad's was just a little orchard. He had a U-pick thing, and I'd help him a little with that in the summers or whatever. But the Vasics, they lived across the field from me. Old Tony was like one of the original Llano colony people out there, and he had married Betty, and Betty and my mom were friends in school, so they were in our house or we were in their house all the time growing up. So mainly I worked for Vasics and Frank Moyer, and they were partners in an orchard down by the creek. They called it the River Ranch. Yeah, down on the bottom of 75th and probably U, where I think that's U, where it turns there. That was a neat orchard. It had ragweed taller than me, and one day I walked home, my eyes were so puffed up shut I couldn't see the road from hay fever. And after high school, I worked for the Forest Service for a few seasons. I started on trail crew, and a buddy of mine, his brother worked engineering, and told me they had an opening. And Ron Scott had told me about the trail crew opening. He was engineering, and so I got every day or two after work, I'd go hit up on Herb. Hey, you gonna give me that job? And yeah, he got tired of putting up with me, so he gave me the job with engineering, and I enjoyed that the best I can remember ever liking a job. But I didn't really like the government a lot. I could see where the forestry was going with. I don't like the way they've turned out, especially. Some of them are good people, but I'm not so sure about the top management all the time. I was working out of Valley Yermo up at the, you know, I worked right there. Oh, Jiminy, on trail crew, we'd get our carryall out of the main yard every morning and take off. And then engineering, we had a yard right next door, and kind of between remember when the trailer court was there? Okay, yeah. My one buddy, he lived there at the trailer court, and we'd all meet up early in the morning before it was daylight, drinking our coffee and getting ready to go out and roll again. And I know the one big fire, the boss and me came home in the middle of the night after being out there 4 days on the fire, and I finally got home. That was one heck of a paycheck, 4 days. I got like an average of 20 hours a day in, but the worst thing about that fire is we kept telling the pilot on a chopper that he was overloaded, and he kept telling us to put more on it. And about a half hour later, the big boss comes by and says, "Don't tell anybody, but that chopper went down and 8 people died." And it was so sad because that guy, he shouldn't have played the hero. He just kept telling us, put more on it, put more on it. And anyway, that was sad. But when I was, my third year of Little League, they built a Little League diamond back there on the park. And the town or the park gave up the rights on most of the field, and then the school had the outfield property, so they gave the outfield to the park for the Little League, whatever. And that lasted till like a year or two after I got out of Little League, and the town was so messed up that Little League folded about then. And my granddad and Jack Bones, they got together, and Grandpa ended up buying the park from Jack, or the water district actually. And Jack was the head, I guess, of the water district at the time. And so I got to grow up with a Little League diamond in my backyard, and my granddad ended up buying that, and so I got to have a ball diamond that was all mine, kind of, for a long time. Pretty much all mine, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. It's still there to a degree or another. It's falling apart now pretty bad, but But it was cool. I don't know. We had a few good town parties there, whatever. Every year they'd have a pig roast or whatever they did back there, and I kind of remember that a little bit. And when I was a kid, they'd go, "Well, how do you guys stand it out here? There's nothing to do." But we grew up out there hunting and fishing and running around, and me and my buddies didn't go to arcades or whatever. We'd be out with our rifles and that or fishing poles in the summer and during the season, and we could be plenty happy without having all that. We didn't have cell phones and all that. We had to make our own fun. The orchards aren't there anymore, and it was an orchard town basically. There weren't hardly any houses, not like now. I mean, my folks sold old Patterson property behind Orbit. That was 10 acres, and they put 21 or whatever homes back there. That was one of the first big housing tracts in Little Rock, other than over on U2 and U3, what we called the castles back then, and that was just a couple little short streets. But now there's like most of Little Rock's on parts that weren't even really hardly part of town back then. Little Rock's a funny town. You can't go back. I wish we could. Um, for some reason, there's just not enough money in farming and whatever. Even the big farmers like Scataglia's, when they lost money 3 years in a row, that was it, and they took off. And well, the thing that people from the city comment the most is all the open space. I don't see it that way because I remember when it was open, we'd go out the back door loading our guns and be hunting within a minute or two off the property. And now you can't shoot a rifle in any direction but when somebody's out there. And I I always liked open spaces, and I liked going out and finding old home sites from way back that nothing was left but the junk on the ground. And now it's just the fact that I'm kind of getting in the point of being too old to really want to move. Kind of settled in. Me and Cindy got it pretty nice up on the hill where we're at, and it's sort of like, unfortunately, the property values to get what we got somewhere else, we'd have to sell for half of what we'd pay for something else that where we'd be getting comparable. It would be nice if Little Rock could become more like it used to be in a hometown kind of feeling, and but I kind of gave up on it my own self, maybe.